She didn't want to run. She didn't want to look over her shoulder or hide away in the corners of the city. But her father, in an infinite level of stupidity and poor decisions, sold her to the gang that runs her hab block. And so here she was, running hard, a group of 3 gangers chasing her. Her fate all but sealed, as her species are not built for endurance. Sure, they could run and are known for their burst speed, but her pursuers were Valmite, insectoids that are tireless, emotionless, and unyielding. She stumbled into an alleyway, gasping as she was trapped, a dead end with no way out, her muscles already at their limits. Her lungs were grasping for insufficient air, and her fur was wet and heavy from the rain. Was this it? Was this as far as she got? 2 weeks of freedom while hunted? She looked around, hopeful to find a pipe or bottle to use as a weapon, but the only thing in the alleyway was the body of some homeless reject. Her pursuers scuttled in a few seconds after, clinking their mandibles as they spoke, their translators giving their alien dialect meanings as it converted their speech to galactic common. "See, the lop-bups are stupid and can't sense or remember terrain," the largest one said, standing at nearly 6 units tall as it rose out of the octopedal run his kind uses. Yeah, stupid and dumb," the smallest one responded. "So what now, brothers? What were our orders?" "Boss wants her whole and unblemished. Apparently he has a fancy for her," the middle one said, likely the leader of these 3. "Or at least her kind." "I don't want to go with you," she shouted back at them, her hand reaching into her pockets to find anything she could use, but to her panicking mind she found only a small penknife. "Come on now. We aren't the bad guys. We are just the delivery boys. If you cooperate, we will be nice and buy you some grub and a change of clothes," the middle one said. She looked around. There were a few windows above them, but the city was mostly abandoned at this time of night. Her chances were growing slim as she willed herself to break her own rules. Taking a deep breath, she screamed as loud as she could, "Someone, please save me!" The 3 Valmites pounced, their bodies shadowing her from the light of the street like a veil of despair. Shutting her eyes tight, she wasn't ready, but a loud and hard impact snapped her eyes open. 2 of the Valmites had backed off. The smallest was lying on the floor, its head severely damaged, and a tall alien standing in front of her, its back to her and hands balled into fists, one covered in the thick ichor-like blood of Valmites. "Yeah, I heard enough to know I can't sit back and watch. Not when you call out for help like that," the alien said, its tone and clear voice giving away what it was. A human. She looked around, realizing the homeless person she saw before wasn't dead. But to her, he may as well have been. Humans are worldless and have no rights or protections in the Empire's territories. Their homeworld was destroyed before the Empire found them, and while they are tolerated, they are considered the lowest of the low, worse than the scum chasing her. But then again, this human stepped in and saved her, so maybe if she played her cards right, it would protect her. They have orders to kidnap me and sell me into slavery. Your kind don't stand for such practices. Please help me," she said, trying to sound innocent and desperate. The middle one, quick on the beat and weighing his chances, didn't miss a chance to quickly retort, "No, her father sold her off to pay off his debt. We are just here to collect," he said, standing a bit more relaxed and gesturing for his larger compatriot to do the same. "Besides, if you help us, we will split the bounty with you. 4,000 credits can go a long way for a hiveless like you." I bet it would," the human said, but pulled out a long, serrated combat knife. "But I am not in the habit of going back on my choices, and I don't need money." It looked over its shoulder to her, its eyes shining red with cybernetic augments. "Are you a citizen of the Empire?" She hesitantly nodded, unsure of why it would ask such a random question. Her kind's homeworld was intact and paid its tithe regularly. "Stay there. I'll deal with the trash, Rumi," the human said before charging the Valmites. She had no time to consider its choice of words as the battle unfolded in front of her. To her shock and slight horror, the human was in full control for the minute it took for him to dispatch the Valmites. His combat knife seemed redundant, as his fists were enough to crack the exoskeletons of the Valmites. But to call what he did anything less than a decisive victory was an understatement. The human incapacitated the larger one before turning his attention to the middle one, ending the confrontation swiftly. Swinging the blade through the air to get most of the blood off, he then wiped the blade clean on a rag before sheathing the weapon again. Looking over at her, he smiled softly. "Don't you worry, Rumi, I will protect you," he said as he walked back over. She stared at the human in shock, her mind recalling as much information as she knew about its kind. But her memory was limited, and all she could glean was that the one in front of her and offering a hand was male, taller than average, and most likely a former soldier of some kind. "Thank you. She trailed off, unsure of what she was meant to do. "My name is Dan Smith," he said as he gathered his small collection of possessions. "I am Zalidarmialphos, but my friends call me Zale," she said back, unsure of what was going on or what to do. But her mind refocused on the word he used to address her. "What is a Rumi?" He smiled wide. "Humans can't rent or own homes, so you are now my roommate. I have more than enough to pay for a few years and other things, but you will be the name on everything. Deal?" he asked, extending a hand to her. She looked at the hand, recognizing the gesture as something void merchants use when they agree on a bargain. Was living with a human worth the risk and stigma, or was she just being foolish? It didn't matter. This human was offering his skills and protection in exchange for a roof over his head, a sentiment she could agree with. Taking his hand, she shook it in one strong and direct motion. "Deal." Zale walked a bit behind the human. They were walking farther away from her HAB unit and towards the edge of this HAB block. He was tall, nearly 6.5 units tall and built for war. Dark brown skin and hair braided back into a short tail. A few scars across his exposed skin and his clothes were shabby, but a uniform from the last war with the Zanalton Confederacy. "So, Dan, you fought in the last war? Why?" she asked slowly, wanting to gain some insight into this human. "Oh, yeah. When you are homeless and in need of a bed and food, fighting is a step up if you get 3 squares and a cot," he said back, as he walked a bit slower so they could walk shoulder to shoulder, his duffel bag slung over his opposite side from her. "I mean, I would have been fighting gangers anyway. At least on the battlefield, it's easy to tell friend from foe." "But you are worldless. You gain nothing from fighting for the Empire, so why fight at all?" she asked back as they made their way down in an elevator to the lower levels of the HAB block. He rubbed at his chin. "Because humanity has a permanent grudge against the Zanalton Confederacy," he said ominously. "Oh, I see," she muttered, feeling that this line of questioning may poke at something he is not comfortable with sharing. "Anyway, let's focus on getting us a place to live," he said, stepping off the elevator and walking not to the administration office, but to the gate out of the arcology she had known as home for all her life. "Wait, where are you going?" she asked, half stepping towards the safety he provided, but still fearful of leaving her comfortable bubble of familiarity. He stopped and looked back, a soft and understanding smile on his face. "You have never left your HAB block, but don't worry, Xale, I'll be right beside you. We are just going 2 HAB blocks over, an hour walk at most." She couldn't stop the nervous gulp, but took his hand as he offered it, shrinking a bit tighter as she left the space she once called her world, the sky above much wider than she imagined, and the streets spacious with ground vehicles traveling on specific roadways. Her eyes flickered as her ears snapped to every small sound that her mind portrayed as a drawing of a blade or the cocking of a firearm, but his presence next to her grounded her fear and anxiety a bit. "You are a Lopbup, right?" he asked with a small smile. "Your kind come from Lopbus Prime." She nodded. "Yeah, is that a problem?" she asked nervously, her ears dropping a bit and fear taking a small hold in her demeanor. "Nah, you bunnyfolk are great company and your ways aren't too far from what humans hold to," he says back with a warm smile. "Bunnyfolk?" she asked. She knew humans use nicknames for other races, but she didn't know the one for her people. He looked over and smiled softly. "Oh, sorry. Bunnies are a type of mammalian animal from Earth, small and fluffy with ears like your people, so we humans sometimes call your kind bunnyfolk." She reached up and felt her long ears that stood a bit off from the sides of her head, running her fingers through them. "Oh, so your people nicknamed us after predators of your world?" He burst out in hearty laughter. "What? No. Bunnies are prey animals that were mostly domesticated by the time of the Sundering. The home fleet has a colony in every one of its livestock hangars. She seemed confused. Your people keep animals alive on your ships? She asked, having seen the human home fleet in the night sky once 5 years ago, like a roaming constellation of thousands of stars. Yeah, humans are omnivores and we need meat and vegetables to live. So when we were preparing to escape Earth, we took as much genetic material to clone our animal companions and friends. He said slowly, a warm smile on his lips. Once we got our hands on artificial gravity tech, we built our first farm bays. And once it was deemed safe, acceptable, and humane, we built one on every ship. She was stunned and shocked by the revelation, and her lips formed her curiosity to sound, "But is it enough to feed a ship?" He smiled. "No, a single farm bay can't feed a whole ship of thousands, but that is what the agri-ships are for." Agricultural ships? She pondered aloud. You have ships in your fleet completely dedicated to growing and feeding your population? Gotta go to one once. It was crazy, but somehow completely organized and handled well, he says in a reminiscing tone. One agri-ship can feed about 50 ships or one of our super carriers. She feels a bit off and nervous. Should you be telling me this? He smiled. There is a saying to anyone that deals with the home fleet. Watch your fire, or see your world crack. He said, we let most that are stupid off with a warning, but those that try to push their supposed claims of strength, we break their fleets and teach them a truth that makes the supergovernments of the galaxy nervous. And what is that? She asked nervously. Earth was a death world. They moved closer to their new hab block. It looked no different from her last one. His last comment left a lingering silence between them, but he cleared his throat holding out a credit chip. Okay, here. Go to the admin office, get a small family unit, and don't answer anything beyond your basic information. Also, if they ask, claim I am your bodyguard and don't tell them where you are from. She nervously took the chip and pocketed it. Taking a deep breath, she settled her nervousness, walked into the administration office and found the renter's desk, happy to see a lopbud sitting behind the desk. Excuse me, I would like to rent a small family unit. The lopbud at the desk was a man who looked over with a sigh. How many inhabitants? 2 medium entities, she said back, taking steadying breaths. The officer looked over and out the window. You can't rent a unit with a human. He is my bodyguard. All payments and naming is my responsibility, she said back, placing the credit chip down. The officer groaned, taking the chip and checking it, and coughed in a bit of surprise. I see. I believe we can get you situated, he said, quickly typing away at his terminal. Can I get yours and your bodyguard's names? I am Xylidar Myalphos. My bodyguard is named Dan, she said quickly, not giving her last name just in case he tried looking her up in the planetary record. He types in the information and looks up, occupation? Self-employed, but my business is legal and allowed in Empire space. It's not important enough for you to record it, she says, trying to sound confident and in control. The officer seemed confused and looked at the readout on the credit chip. Very well. I have a unit free for habitation on level 56, grid B, door 320. Let me get you the key badges, he said, standing up and walking over to the locker behind him, getting the 2 badges out for her and Dan. Please run the first 2 payments now, she said, taking the badges and clipping one to her belt. Of course, the officer said, and typed in something in the chip reader. A soft beep from his phone gave way to his taking of some of the money for himself. Corruption is not uncommon, and far too many low-end workers like him skim a bit off the top. Processing the real payment quickly, he handed her back the chip. There, all squared away. Thank you. I will be making payments at the start of every month going forward. I will not announce our exiting of the unit, she said, taking the chip back and checking how much was taken, smiling a bit as the officer took a typical sum she was told meant not a lot of gang activity. Understandable. We hope you will enjoy your stay here, the officer said as she walked away. Dan looked over as she stepped out. So? 56B 320, and the office took less than in my last hab block. So fewer gangs, she said optimistically. He smiled softly and looked about, spotting what he suspected, only one gang marker drawn over others. That's good, But I think the cut was less because there is only one gang here, and they have a monopoly on illegal activity and a better control on the administration. She frowned, having not considered that possibility. Oh, is that bad? He patted her head, the gesture somehow cheering her up and out of her saddened state of mind. No, it's not bad as long as they aren't affiliated with the gang that has your father's debt. And besides, I don't think we will be staying on the world long anyway. What? She said, shocked as they walked to the elevator. Yeah, sorry to say this, but a gang that can house and keep Valmite will have the influence to hunt you down anywhere on this planet, he said as the elevator started to move. We just needed somewhere with access to the datanet and walls for defense while I call in a ride. Call a ride? Like from the home fleet? She asked nervously. The thought of leaving her birth world is the favorite dream of all children, to travel the void and see the distant worlds only spoken of in news and stories. He chuckles. No, not the fleet, just a friend that should be passing through. She should be here in a month or two, he says, but looks about as the elevator stops halfway up the massive structure, and the maintenance sign flickered on as the doors opened. Come on, there is another elevator nearby. As they walked, she felt a chill run down her fur, like a charge of static setting her nerves on end. Why does it feel like someone is watching me? She asked. Because we were just scanned. The wall we passed has a sensor suite built under it, he whispered, taking her hand gently and keeping her moving. What? Why? Who? She asked quickly, her ears perking up and scanning the area. Most likely the gang that runs the Hab block, he said with a smile. They are trying to figure us out. See, the chip I gave you marked you as a diplomat, but one that doesn't say to which government you belong. What? She asked, horrified, feeling like she was used. Relax. They are confused because I am here. No diplomat would hire a human as a bodyguard, he said softly as they reached a new elevator, pressing the call button. Are we in danger? She asked softly. Not yet, but when we get to the unit, I need you to make a barricade to hide behind. With luck, I can get them to back off, however. It may still get messy, he says as they ride the elevator up to the 56th floor. The elevator's hum faded into the oppressive silence of the hallway, and Zale's eyes darted from one ganger to the next. They were close, too close, and their numbers were steadily growing. The faint sound of boots shuffling against metal flooring echoed in her ears, mixing with the deep thrum of her own heartbeat. Every step felt like an eternity, each one dragging them further into danger. She glanced up at Dan, who was walking alongside her with a casual, unbothered pace, though his body language was taut with an unreadable tension. His expression was unreadable, just as it always was, somewhere between detached and alert, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The knot in her stomach tightened. "What will you do to them?" she asked, barely above a whisper, her voice shaky despite her efforts to remain composed. The fear was hard to push aside now that the gangers were so close, closing in from all sides like wolves circling their prey. Dan didn't break stride, but his voice came, low and chilling. "I will growl and bare my teeth. Those that run will run with reason. Those that stay will be the food of a hungry wolf." Zale felt a shiver race down her spine. The words rang with an eerie, primal certainty that sent a wave of unease flooding through her chest. The phrase, something about it was familiar, but it made no sense. She had heard it before, somewhere. Or perhaps it was the feeling that she had forgotten why it should terrify her that made it all the more unsettling. Choosing to trust him, though the very idea of it made her feel vulnerable, she kept pace, clutching tightly to the few belongings she had left. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to focus on their path. "Relax," Dan said, his voice warm but steady. "More than half of them are probably veterans of a few wars. With any luck, no one's blood will be spilled." Zale nodded, her mind whirling with doubt. She wanted to believe him, but the growing crowd of gangers behind them told a different story. Each one of them was a threat in its own right, and their patience was wearing thin. "What if they don't back down?" she asked, her voice barely audible despite the pounding of her heart. She tried to act calm, trying to convince herself she was in control, but her nerves were beginning to fray. Dan's lips twitched into a small, humorless smile. "I'll do what I do best." The words hung in the air like a promise, but one Zale wasn't sure she wanted to hear. By the time they reached their assigned HAB unit, her hands were clammy, her heart beating faster with every footstep. Without waiting for anything more, she burst through the door and immediately began to barricade herself in. Her mind was racing. She overturned a table, shoved a couch in front of it, anything to create a stronger defense. The room felt cold and sterile, the walls bare, the air stale. It was the perfect place for a fight, she realized grimly. Her breathing quickened as she huddled behind the makeshift barricade, taking the tablet from the wall and activating it to check the camera feed. Her stomach churned when she saw them. 15 gangers, no less, now gathered outside the door. She gripped the tablet tightly, trying to steady her shaky hands. Her eyes flicked from one ganger to the next, calculating the odds, but they all seemed to be waiting for something, for the moment when the confrontation would break out. And as she watched, that moment grew closer. But Dan was different. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch. He calmly removed the long, serrated combat knife from his belt, the blade gleaming like the smile of a predator. With slow, deliberate movements, he pulled a firearm from his sack, checking the chamber as if he were preparing for a casual stroll, rather than facing down a gang of armed men. "Stay here," he said, though it wasn't really a suggestion. Then, without a second thought, he stepped out the door, his silhouette framed by the doorway. His voice, clear and commanding, echoed back to her through the walls. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the gangers with the same eerie calm, "I regret to inform you we've yet to start our work and don't need your assistance at the moment." From behind the barricade, Zale's pulse quickened. She watched the feed anxiously, her eyes darting from the camera to the door. 7 of the gangers stepped back instinctively, eyes widening at the sight of the knife. They hesitated, their hands twitching near their weapons, unsure whether to advance or retreat. But the leader, he was different. His gaze was hard and unyielding. With a sneer, he leveled a crude, black-marketed snub pistol at Dan's chest. "Oh?" the ganger sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're hot shit, don't you? Worldless!" He spat, the liquid hitting the ground with a sharp sound. "Listen, if you're here because of my boss's business, I recommend you leave tonight. This doesn't concern you." Dan's lips twitched into something between a smile and a snarl. "Our business is with the gang controlling the HAB block to your north. Your gang? Not our target," he said, the humor in his voice sending an odd chill through the air. Then, in one fluid motion, Dan swiped the ganger's pistol aside, knocking it from his hand with a sharp motion. The sudden movement was so fast, so precise, that Zale almost didn't register it before Dan's own gun was already aimed under the ganger's chin. "That being said," Dan added, his voice quiet but forceful, "ask your friend there why they're taking steps backward when they should be the toughest of you all." Zale watched as 7 of the remaining gangers, veterans, soldiers, killers, suddenly dropped their rifles, hands raised in immediate surrender. The change in their demeanor was nothing short of dramatic. One of them, a lanky man with a scarred face, spoke up, his voice shaky. "Hey, listen, this guy, he's just following orders. I'm sure the boss is watching. How about we all walk away and I'll come back to talk in the morning, yeah?" Dan's smile remained, though it was laced with dark amusement. "That sounds like a great idea," he said, pulling the barrel of his pistol back. "Now scram!" And they did. In a flurry of movement, the gangers scattered, their boots thudding rapidly against the floor as they retreated. The leader shot one last glare at Dan, but the former military gangers surrounding him stopped him from doing anything foolish. Zale watched in disbelief, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She couldn't understand it. These were hard men, trained killers, yet they had backed down. They had seen something in Dan that made them hesitate. That made them fear. When he returned to the unit, the door clicking softly behind him, he seemed unaffected. He looked down at the barricade Zale had hastily constructed, a small, approving smile on his face. "Good job," he said, his voice warm with approval. "That would have definitely been enough." He sheathed his knife and holstered his gun with smooth, practiced movements before looking up at her. Zale's breath was still shaky, her mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. Dan?" she said, her voice unsure. "Why did they back off? Why were they so scared of you?" He met her eyes, and for a moment something flickered there, something deep and far older than she could understand. His gaze softened, his expression shifting to something almost protective. "It's best you don't know," he said softly, his tone surprisingly gentle. "But I can assure you I will never hurt you. We're roommates, right?" Zale looked at him, the unease in her chest beginning to fade. There was something in his voice, a sincerity, a promise that she couldn't ignore. "Yeah," she whispered, feeling a wave of warmth spread through her chest despite the lingering fear. "I trust you, Rumi." Dan smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "I'm going to sleep. If you need something, come wake me up, okay?" As he turned toward the room closest to the door, Zale felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She wasn't sure why, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was about Dan, she was safe. And for tonight, that was enough. The night passed uneventfully after the encounter with the gang, but Zale's mind refused to quiet. The strange revelation she'd uncovered had taken root in her thoughts, gnawing at her like an unanswered riddle. She had spent hours poring over the data on Earth, humanity, and Dan, information that only raised more questions. Her lop-up curiosity, always relentless and boundless, kept her up long into the night, searching for connections, for clues. But the more she uncovered, the more confused and awestruck she became. Earth, humanity's original homeworld, had been at the heart of everything she found. It was a planet that had once been a death world, a place far too hostile and dangerous for intelligent life to evolve. The conditions of the world, its violent storms, vicious creatures, and unpredictable landscapes should have made survival impossible, and yet humanity had not only survived, but thrived. Over millennia, they had built grand civilizations, created technologies, and, despite the inherent dangers, managed to carve out a place for themselves in the universe. Eventually, humanity had opened its doors to trade, bringing goods, knowledge, and culture to other species across the stars. Peace had reigned for a time, and Earth had become a respected symbol of resilience. But that peace had shattered. The event known as the Sundering had left Earth as little more than a dead husk in space. The planet's core ruptured in a catastrophic event, sending the once verdant world into ruin. What had caused the Sundering remained a mystery. Some whispered of internal strife, a final destructive civil war. Others speculated that it had been the work of external forces, perhaps galactic sabotage by an enemy who feared humanity's rapid rise. No one knew for sure. The result, however, was the same. Earth was gone, and with it, humanity's once proud home. The survivors, those who had managed to escape in the wake of the devastation, had no choice but to adapt. They had become worldless nomads, wandering the stars in the remains of their fleets. These fleets, now known as the Home Fleet, had become their new homes, a patchwork of ships and stations that drifted through space, carrying the last remnants of their species. They were a small, scattered group, slow to rebuild and largely ignored by the broader galactic powers. Their existence had become a bittersweet reminder of a tragic past. The term worldless was used by others to describe them, both a label of sorrow and a symbol of their displaced, fragmented nature. The Home Fleet was once a beacon of hope, of survival against impossible odds. Now it was a shadow of its former glory, largely forgotten or dismissed by the greater galactic community. Some saw humanity with sympathy, but many more viewed them with disdain. An uncomfortable reminder of a species that had once nearly conquered its world, only to lose it in a catastrophic blaze. And then there was Dan. Zale's fascination with him deepened as she dug into his past. The calm, controlled soldier had always intrigued her, but the more she uncovered, the more she realized there was a side to him he hadn't shared. A side buried beneath layers of military records, covert operations, and shadowy histories. Dan's record in the Empire's military was nothing short of stellar. He had enlisted early, fighting in nearly every major conflict the Empire had been involved in for over a decade. His name was mentioned repeatedly in reports, praised for his precision, his courage, and his heroism in battle. Yet, despite this, there was something strange about his record. He had never been promoted. His achievements, though remarkable, seemed to go unnoticed. The reason? He was worldless. As Zale dug deeper, she came across another anomaly: Dan's cybernetic eyes, implants. The details indicated that they were not standard issue. These had been installed during his youth, likely while he was still with the home fleet. This raised even more questions. Why had his eyes been modified at such a young age? And why, of all things, would humanity's survivors, these worldless, have access to such advanced cybernetics? The answers only led her deeper into a labyrinth of uncertainty. She stumbled upon mentions of a mysterious program, the Warhound Order. The Warhounds were rumored to be part of a covert human super-soldier program established after the Sundering. Part weapon, part spy, part assassin, the Warhounds hunted humanity's enemies across the galaxy, operating from the shadows and executing their missions with terrifying precision. The only physical evidence of their existence? Their combat knives, long, serrated blades meant for brutal efficiency. What struck Zale as peculiar was how these knives were not just tied to the Warhounds. Humans who had left the home fleet, whether as traders, soldiers, or wanderers, often carried similar serrated knives. It was a rite of passage, a tool for survival in the harsh, lawless regions of the galaxy. There was a shared sense of purpose in carrying these weapons, something primal that connected the worldless. Zale's research also illuminated the complex relationships humanity had with other species, particularly the Xanalton. The Xanalton were a species with whom humans had a long-standing grudge, one that extended far beyond the Sundering. Despite the years that had passed, the animosity between the two species seemed to run deep, and Zale had yet to uncover the full scope of what had caused it. Dan had mentioned the Xanalton before, alluding to their role in his personal history, but he had not yet revealed the full story. By the time morning came, Zale's mind was overwhelmed with questions. There were far more mysteries surrounding humanity's past, and even more tangled within Dan's own history. She knew she had to confront him to see if he could shed light on the darkness she had uncovered. She found him lounging on the couch in the common room, his posture relaxed but his eyes wary, as if he knew this conversation was coming. The calm, collected soldier was still there, but there was something else in his demeanor now, something guarded. "Dan," Zale began, her voice hesitant but determined. "I've been researching. I found a lot of information about Earth, about humanity, and about you." Dan's eyebrow arched slightly, but he didn't speak, waiting for her to continue. "Your record in the Empire's military is incredible," Zale said, her tone steadying as she pressed on. "But you were never promoted. Why is that? And your implants? They were done before you enlisted, weren't they?" For a moment, a flicker of discomfort crossed Dan's face, but it was gone in an instant. He sighed and leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. "The implants. Yeah," he muttered, as if weighing his words. "I had terrible vision as a kid. It was either get the implants or stay home. My family didn't have the resources to do much else. So they made the choice for me, and I joined the home fleet. They took care of the rest." Zale's brow furrowed. "But then there's the Warhound program. I found mentions of it. Humans like you, spies, soldiers, assassins, knives like yours meant for killing." Dan's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. A coldness crept into his voice. "The Warhounds are just a myth, a story. There's nothing to them, Zale. Nothing at all. You've been misled." Zale leaned forward, pressing further. "But your knife, your eyes, your past. Why do you have all of this, Dan?" He hesitated, as if battling a wave of conflicting emotions. His gaze softened, but there was something in his eyes, a heaviness that spoke of things buried deep within. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Okay," he said slowly. "The Warhounds are a myth. That's what they want everyone to believe. But here's the truth. I'm not just a soldier, I'm a hunter." "A hunter?" Zale repeated, confusion lacing her voice. "What does that mean?" Dan's gaze darkened even further. "I'm part of a special unit within the home fleet. We do the jobs no one else can. We're spies, assassins, investigators. We track down threats to humanity. Right now, I'm hunting down an alien who stole something crucial from us, something that could destroy our entire agricultural infrastructure. Codes, genetic sequences that sustain the species we keep on our ships. If those get out, our ecosystems could collapse. It's a matter of survival. Zale's heart skipped a beat as the gravity of his words sank in. Her initial unease about Dan had been justified. There was more to him than she had ever imagined, secrets, dangerous ones. But despite everything, there was one thing she couldn't ignore. Dan had always protected her. He had never once shown her harm. She looked at him, uncertainty and concern mingling in her gaze. "But what about the Xanalton?" she asked. "What happened between humanity and them?" Dan's expression tightened, and for the first time, Zale saw a flicker of something raw in his eyes. Anger, regret, perhaps even fear. "That's another story," he said quietly. "One I'm not ready to share." Zale leaned back in her chair, processing the weight of his words. His past was tangled with secrets, lies, and mysteries. But he had trusted her with part of the truth, and that was something. Something that meant something. "Just be careful, okay?" she said, her voice soft, a hint of concern woven through it. "Please." Dan met her gaze, offering a small but genuine smile. "I always am. You should be too, Rumi." Zale wasn't entirely sure what to make of everything she had learned. But one thing was certain. Whatever Dan's past, whatever secrets he harbored, she wasn't ready to turn away from him yet. She needed time to process, to understand. But for now, she would stay by his side. Even if the truth was darker than she could imagine. If you love engaging stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all the latest episodes from FY Stories.